Both pilots suddenly collapsed mid-flight, leaving no one to fly the plane. She was only flying commercial, but when both pilots collapsed, even the air marshal watched her land, calm and certain, while fear spread through the cabin. No training given. No warning. Just one quiet stranger who refused to freeze. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Grace Miller sat in seat 22C with her tray table down and a small cup of coffee going cold beside her book. She wore a plain gray sweater and old jeans, and her brown hair was tied back in a simple bun. To the people around her, she looked like any other tired traveler on the morning flight from Chicago to Seattle. No one on the plane knew that she had once flown fighter jets for the United States Air Force, or that she had landed aircraft in storms that would have grounded most pilots twice her age. She had left that life behind 6 years ago, and she rarely spoke of it, even to close friends. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Grace found herself doing what she always did without thinking. She listened to the engines. She felt the small shifts in the cabin pressure. She noticed the way the wings moved slightly in the wind, and the way the captain made a smooth turn a few minutes after takeoff. Most passengers never paid attention to these small details, but for Grace, they were as natural as breathing. Old habits, she often told herself, never really go away, even when you try hard to forget them. 6 years earlier, Captain Grace Miller had been one of the most skilled pilots in her squadron. Her fellow pilots knew her by her call sign, Falcon, a name she had earned after guiding a damaged jet safely back to base during a night training mission that had gone badly wrong. She had flown dangerous missions, trained younger pilots, and earned respect from everyone who worked with her. But a serious back injury during a hard landing had ended her flying career long before she was ready to stop. The doctors told her she could never sit in a military cockpit again. She left the service quietly, took a job as a flight safety consultant, and tried to build a normal life far away from airplanes. She rarely used the name Falcon anymore, and most people she now knew had no idea it had ever belonged to her. Yet even now, every time she stepped onto a commercial flight, part of her still felt like a pilot, not a passenger. For a long time after leaving the service, Grace found it hard to watch airplanes take off without feeling a small ache in her chest. She missed the noise of the engines, the weight of the controls in her hands, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what to do in an emergency. Her friends often told her she should try to move on completely, to stop watching flight paths on her phone or reading aviation magazines late at night. But Grace never fully let go. She kept her old training manuals in a box under her bed, and once or twice a year, she still practiced emergency checklists in her head, just in case she ever needed them again. She never expected that day to come on an ordinary Tuesday morning flight to Seattle. About 2 hours into the flight, the plane hit a patch of rough air. It was not unusual for this route, and most passengers barely looked up from their phones or their in-flight movies. But Grace noticed something different this time. The plane did not settle back into smooth flight the way it should have. Instead, it dipped slightly, then leveled off in a way that felt uneven, almost hesitant. She glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw a flight attendant hurrying up the aisle with a worried look on her face. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant returned, walking quickly, almost running, toward the back of the plane. She stopped near a man in a business suit sitting a few rows ahead of Grace and asked in a low voice if there was a doctor on board. Her hands were shaking slightly as she spoke. Grace felt her stomach tighten. In her years of flying, she had learned that flight attendants rarely showed fear unless something was seriously wrong. Word spread through the cabin in whispers. A man near the front stood up and said he was a nurse. He followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit, and passengers began turning to each other with confused and frightened faces. Grace unclipped her seatbelt and moved quietly toward the front of the plane, staying calm, watching everything carefully. She had trained for years to notice small signs of trouble, and every instinct she had was telling her that this was not a simple medical issue with a passenger. As she walked up the aisle, she noticed the plane was no longer holding a steady course. It drifted slightly to the left, then corrected itself in a stiff, mechanical way that told her the autopilot, not a human hand, was making the adjustments. The overhead speakers stayed silent, with no announcement from the cockpit explaining the strange turbulence or the delay in service. In her years of military flying, Grace had learned that silence from the cockpit during a real problem was often worse than any announcement, because it usually meant the people up front were too busy fighting the emergency to speak to anyone. When she reached the galley area near the cockpit, she overheard part of a conversation that made her blood run cold. Both the captain and the first officer had suddenly become unresponsive. No one knew exactly why. One moment they had been talking normally to air traffic control, and the next moment, both of them had slumped forward in their seats. The autopilot was still flying the plane in a straight line, but nobody in the cockpit was in control, and no one on board knew how to safely land a commercial jet. A man in a plain blue jacket stepped forward and showed a small badge. He introduced himself as Agent Ryan Holt, a Federal Air Marshal assigned to the flight. His voice was steady, but his eyes showed real concern as he spoke with the flight attendants about what to do next. Grace watched him for a moment, then stepped closer and said quietly that she used to fly military aircraft and might be able to help. Agent Holt turned and looked at her carefully, clearly trying to decide whether to trust a stranger with such an unusual claim. He asked her several sharp questions about flight instruments, engine controls, and emergency procedures. Grace answered each one clearly and without hesitation, describing exactly how she would check the aircraft systems and communicate with ground control if she were given the chance. Her answers were precise, calm, and full of real technical knowledge that a person without training could never fake. Slowly, the doubt on Agent Holt's face began to fade, replaced by something closer to careful hope. He asked her one final question, whether she truly believed she could land a plane like this one safely. Grace looked him directly in the eyes and said yes. The nurse who had gone forward earlier confirmed that both pilots were breathing and had a normal pulse, but neither of them responded to voice or touch. It looked like some kind of sudden illness, though no one could say for certain what had caused it. There was no time to wait for answers. The plane needed a pilot now, and the only person on board with real flying experience was a quiet woman who had spent the last 6 years pretending she had left the sky behind forever. Agent Holt made the decision quickly. He guided Grace into the cockpit and helped move the unconscious first officer gently to one side so she could reach the controls. Grace slid into the seat, adjusted it slightly, and felt her hand settle onto the controls with a familiarity that surprised even her. The instruments in front of her were different from the fighter jets she used to fly, but the basic principles were the same, and years of training came rushing back with surprising clarity. She picked up the radio and contacted air traffic control, explaining calmly that the original pilots were incapacitated and that she was a former military pilot now flying the aircraft. The controller on the ground responded immediately, clearing other planes out of the area and preparing emergency crews at the nearest airport. Grace listened carefully, repeated each instruction back to confirm she understood, and began adjusting the plane's heading and altitude with slow, careful movements. Behind her, Agent Holt stood in the cockpit doorway, watching every move she made with quiet intensity. As the plane began its descent, the weather turned worse than expected. Strong winds pushed against the aircraft, and rain streaked across the windshield, making the runway lights hard to see in the distance. Grace felt her pulse quicken, but her hand stayed steady on the controls. She had landed aircraft in far worse conditions during her military service, though never with more than 100 passengers depending on every single decision she made. She reminded herself to breathe slowly and focus only on the next few seconds, just as she had been trained to do so long ago. The controller's voice came through her headset again, giving her final instructions for the approach. Grace lowered the landing gear, adjusted her speed, and lined the aircraft up carefully with the runway ahead. The wind pushed hard against one side of the plane, forcing her to make small corrections with the controls to keep the nose pointed exactly where it needed to be. Passengers in the cabin sat in tense silence, gripping their armrests, many of them praying quietly as the ground grew closer through the rain-streaked windows. Just as the runway came into view, a warning light flashed on the panel in front of her. One of the landing gear indicators was not showing a clear signal, which meant she could not be certain the wheels were fully locked into place. Grace felt her heart beat faster, but she kept her voice calm as she reported the problem to air traffic control. The controller told her to circle once if she needed more time, but Grace knew the plane was low on fuel after the long, uneven flight, and a second attempt might not be possible. She quickly ran through the backup procedure she remembered from years of training, cycling the gear lever once more and watching closely as the light finally turned steady and green. There would be no second attempt needed after all, but for a few long seconds, the entire cockpit had held its breath along with her. Agent Holt stayed close behind her seat the entire time, saying nothing, simply watching with sharp, careful eyes as the runway lights grew brighter and closer. He had seen many dangerous situations in his career, but nothing quite like this, a stranger from seat 22C guiding a crippled aircraft safely through a storm. In that quiet cockpit, with rain hammering the windows and the ground rushing up to meet them, he found himself holding his breath along with everyone else on board, trusting a woman he had known for less than an hour with all of their lives. The wheels touched the runway with a firm but controlled bump, and the plane rolled forward smoothly as Grace applied the brakes with practiced precision. A wave of relief swept through the cabin as passengers realized they were finally on solid ground. She was only flying commercial, but when both pilots collapsed, even the air marshal watched her land, calm and certain, guiding a plane full of strangers safely home through fear, rain, and uncertainty. As the aircraft slowed to a stop on the taxiway, emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their lights flashing red and blue against the gray morning sky. Paramedics rushed aboard to check on the captain and first officer, who were slowly beginning to show small signs of movement, their eyes fluttering open in confusion as they were carefully carried off the plane. Doctors later discovered that a rare reaction to something in their in-flight meal had caused the sudden collapse, a strange and unlucky coincidence that no one could have predicted. Grace stayed in her seat for a moment after everyone else had begun standing, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed and there was nothing left for her to control. Agent Holt turned to her as the cabin doors opened and thanked her quietly, his voice full of genuine respect. He admitted that when she had first spoken up in the galley, part of him had doubted a stranger could really help, and he told her he was glad he had trusted his instincts instead of his doubts. He said that in all his years protecting flights, he had never seen anyone stay so calm under such pressure, and that her actions today had certainly saved every single life on board. When he asked her name for his official report, Grace paused for a moment before giving both her name and, almost as an afterthought, the old call sign her squadron had once used for her. Agent Holt smiled and said that Falcon seemed like exactly the right name for what he had just watched. Passengers who walked past the cockpit on their way out looked at her with a mixture of surprise and deep gratitude, some of them thanking her directly, others simply staring in quiet amazement at the woman who had seemed so ordinary just a few hours earlier. A young mother traveling with her son stopped to shake Grace's hand, telling her that her little boy had been asking who was flying the plane, and that she now had a story she would tell him for the rest of his life. An older man who had been sitting near the front, gripping his seat through the entire descent, simply nodded at her with tears in his eyes, unable to find the right words to say. News of the landing spread quickly, and reporters soon learned about the former Air Force captain who had stepped forward when no one else could. Camera crews waited outside her apartment for 2 days, hoping for an interview, while her phone filled with messages from old friends and former squadron mates who had seen her name on the news. Grace answered a few questions politely but kept her comments brief, saying only that she had done what any trained pilot would have done in her position. She had no interest in becoming a public hero, and within a few days, the news moved on to other stories, and she quietly returned to her normal life, back to her small apartment and her job as a safety consultant, though something inside her had clearly changed. In the weeks that followed, Grace often thought about that flight and the strange twist of fate that had placed her in seat 22C on that particular morning. She realized that although her military career had ended earlier than she wanted, the skills she had worked so hard to build had never truly left her. They had simply been waiting quietly for the right moment to matter again. The airline later sent her a private letter of thanks, along with an offer to join their emergency training program as a guest instructor, teaching new pilots how to stay calm when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. Grace accepted the offer, not because she wanted attention, but because she finally understood that her years of hard training were meant to help others, not just herself. Agent Holt kept in touch with her long after that morning, and the two of them became unlikely friends, often talking about how close that flight had come to ending very differently. He told her once that most people go their whole lives never finding out what they are truly capable of, but that she had been given that answer in the space of a single terrifying hour. Grace often thought about how easily she could have stayed quiet in her seat that day, telling herself that someone else would surely step forward to help. But she hadn't stayed quiet, and because of that single choice, everyone on that plane had made it home safely to the people waiting for them. She still flew as a passenger sometimes, still noticed the small sounds of the engines and the subtle movements of the wings, but now she carried a quiet peace with her, knowing that when it truly mattered, she had been ready. The box of old training manuals still sat under her bed, though she no longer felt the need to hide it away. Every so often, she would take one out, read through a few pages, and smile quietly to herself, grateful that Falcon, the pilot she once thought she had lost forever, had never really disappeared at all.